Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today we're going to do a weekend review show for the weekend of July 13th through the 15th. I'm going to walk through the top 10 of the box office, do some deeper dives on the new wide releases like Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation and Skyscraper. And then we will briefly touch upon some limited releases and how they're doing. And then I will sort of look at the next few weeks at the box office and see what's going to be big and what might fail. So let's dive into the top 10 here for the weekend of July 13th through the 15th. Again, these are estimates. The Friday and Saturday numbers here are actual. The Sunday number obviously is an estimate because I'm recording this around noon my time. But that being said, these estimates are usually very accurate and usually not off by more than 5% or something like that. So let's dive right into the top 10 and see what happened this weekend. Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation did come in at number one. The Sony animation picture made $44.1 million. This was in about 4,300 theaters. Its per theater average was just over $10,300. Part of doing this show is not just to throw numbers at you, right? To sort of give you some sort of context and the narrative around what that number actually means. So 44.1 million sounds pretty high for an animation film in general. Opening up in July, it's not a huge franchise. It's not Incredibles. It's not Pixar. It's coming from Sony here. But if you look at the other Hotel Transylvania films, the original opened up in September 2012. You know what's interesting here is the last two movies opened up in fall as Halloween movies. Obviously Transylvania, right? Dracula. For this one, they decided to push it into summer and give it a whole summer theme. Let's see how that played out. So the original opened at 42 million back in 2012. Closed out at just shy of $150 million domestically. Hotel Transylvania 2 came out 3 years after that in 2015, also September, basically the same weekend in September, that last weekend. That opened at 48 and then closed out at 169, so better and better, right? This one's right in the middle of those two, right? So Hotel Transylvania 3 opens up at 44. Where's it going to close out at? The consensus here now with children's films, like we're talking multipliers now, the average film is around 2.7 multiplier, somewhere around that in that range. Children's films are usually higher, 3x or more. So the bare minimum that this is going to make domestically is 130, right? It'll easily pass 130. There's no reason that it wouldn't. Cinema score was A minus, which is good. It's not fantastic. It's not A and A plus, but it's pretty good. People enjoyed it. There doesn't seem to be any really massive backlash to it in terms of the quality. So I don't think its legs are going to be hurt all that much. It's going to have some typical summer animation children's films legs. So at least 3x, I think, is a good bet. Tomato meter was 60% from critics. So it's not, critic-wise, not received all that well. Audience score is a 57% Rotten Tomatoes, but again, we kind of have to push that to the side because it's so easily hacked. We more have to go with cinema score of the A minus. So what does this performance mean? Well, if you're comparing it to the last couple of films, it's right in line. Like it's not really that off that much. Deadline was saying it might have like a 3.5x multiplier. If that happens, then what are you looking at? You're looking at 155-ish. I think it's a good take. I do wonder though, one question I have about this series that I didn't look up before here is what's its international take. So it's a really big international film too. On the last movie, Hotel Transylvania 2, it did domestically 169, but foreign did 303 for a total of 470. So it was only 35% domestic take, 64% foreign take. So this is going to have a big haul internationally as well. And so I think this is a win. If I had to put like a simple conclusion, it's a win for Sony. It's only $80 million production budget. It's going to have a great multiplier. It's going to play for a while. It's going to make a lot of money overseas. I think it's one of those movies that I was not tracking at all just because I'm not a big children's film person. I don't have kids. I don't really have a lot of friends that have kids. So I'm usually blindsided by these films because I'm just like, oh, where did this come from? But Hotel Transylvania 3 is a great, solid hit right now. And it's going to make a lot of money. Interesting technique they did for this movie was that Amazon Prime and Atom Tickets. If you don't know Atom Tickets, it's an app for buying tickets. They're basically taking on Fandango and doing a really good job. If you've not used Atom Tickets, do check it out. It's a really cool app and a great way to buy tickets. They did a weird preview thing for this back on June 30th. So 2 weeks before it opens, they made $1.3 million off this preview. And I think that goes to its domestic take. I don't think they put that in the Thursday preview number. I think they just lumped it into this weekend. But a really good idea. Got people aware of the movie. That could backfire if the movie was terrible. But based on what I'm seeing from the audiences, at least, it seems like the reaction's pretty decent. It's not a terrible movie. It's not a masterpiece. It's not like a Pixar masterpiece like Up or something like that, or Inside Out. But it's enjoyable and people really liked it. So I think it's a solid win here, and I think kind of a little bit of a coup for Sony just to push this out in summer. Only a few weeks after Incredibles 2, and it's still opening over 40, gonna make over probably 150 domestically and well over 450 internationally. So I think Sony made the right move by putting it out this weekend. But Hotel Transylvania 3, we'll keep an eye on that one. In terms of like longer term performance, we're going to look for drops that are under 50% here on out for until it sort of runs out of steam completely. If we see drops above 45% and the 50%, it might be a little bit of a problem. But I don't see that really happening. I think Hotel Transylvania is going to be a really good win here for Sony. But that was number one. Number two this weekend was Ant-Man and the Wasp. Did 28.8 million, just shy of 29 million. A really hefty 62% drop from its opening weekend. Its per theater average this weekend was about $6,900 per theater. Total take so far for Ant-Man and the Wasp is $133 million. This one is interesting because it opened pretty depressed last weekend. It had that $76 million opening. Here's a case where the estimate was actually too high. Usually estimates are a little bit too low and the actuals come in higher on Monday afternoon. In that case, the estimate was about 76 something and it dropped down to 75.8 million. So and that sort of speaks to a bigger issue, I think, with Ant-Man, the sequel, is that tracking had it at about 70 to 80, and it ended up opening right in the middle of that, which seems great. But I think the expectation outside of tracking was, oh man, they're screwing up tracking again. It's going to do 85. It's going to do 90 something. It's going to do over 100. I thought it was going to do over 100. It's an MCU film. They have not opened a movie under $100 million since Doctor Strange, probably, which was almost 3 years ago. So I had thought MCU had sort of moved on to another echelon of quality and performance. That's not the case, right? Ant-Man and the Wasp opened pretty low, I think, compared to MCU expectations. One thing to think about, you say but tracking said 70 to 80. That's great. But remember, tracking is just an internal measure of hype, essentially. It does not have any financial end game associated with it. It's basically they go out and they survey people. Have you heard of this? Would you recommend it? How aware are you of this? And then they make an extrapolation off those numbers on how well it's going to do. That has nothing to do with the production budget, has nothing to do with the financial expectation of the film. And I think the financial expectation of this film from the studio, and I think from other people in the industry, was higher. I was thinking at least 80. 80, I felt like it was the basement. 80 to 100 would have been a good range. 90 would have been great. And there was, I think, a slight expectation here that it was going to overperform like Black Panther did, like Avengers Infinity War did, and break out into that low 100s, 105, 110 range. That didn't happen. Right? So something happened here. And with this pretty significant drop in its second weekend, it's not unheard of for an MCU movie, especially a sequel. You got two front-loading factors here, right? It's going to sort of heighten the opening weekend. One, MCU films obviously has a very specific fan base that rushes out to see them, so that's one front-loading factor. The second factor, then, it's a sequel, right? So the more focused an audience is, the more rabid the fan base is, the more likely it's going to be significantly front loaded. And with a movie like Ant-Man and the Wasp, if you're not an MCU fan, you're probably not going to see it. And if you're not an Ant-Man fan of the original, which made $180 million domestically, it wasn't like a tiny film, you're probably going to go see this. So it's like, it's a pretty small little sliver of people. Now, all those people go, right? I guarantee you every MCU person's going to go see this. Everyone who saw Ant-Man 1 is probably going to go see this. So they show up, but it is a kind of tiny sliver, a really targeted demographic. So that's why you see a lot of front loading here. Now, is that 60% like super bad? It's not really that bad comparatively, but it's significantly higher than you'd want to see. Especially if you're work at Disney, it seems a little bit high to me. I think anything in the 55 to 60% range would be a little bit more like, okay, this is fine. This is going to play well for the long term. But we've seen this before with the comic book movie genre. Most notably, Deadpool 2 had a massive drop in its second weekend, and also Spider-Man Homecoming had a really, really massive drop in its second weekend. And those ended up sort of recovering, especially Spider-Man Homecoming last summer. It was really doomsday when that second weekend hit. People were like, what is happening? Like, the opening weekend was depressed. It was open at 117, then had I think it was a 60-something% drop in its second weekend. And then it really recovered. I expect Ant-Man and the Wasp to do the same. If I wouldn't be that worried about it if I was Disney or MCU, the people. It's going to be fine. There's not a ton coming out. The rest of the summer is super, super quiet. The only really big movie coming out is Mission Impossible. And so this will have a clear runway for a very long time, at least 2 months from its opening. I think it's still going to be playing and still doing okay. But it is something to watch, and we're going to watch it pretty closely. Because if it doesn't follow that pattern, right? If this MCU sequel does not follow the pattern of Spider-Man Homecoming, or maybe even something like Deadpool 2 where it rebounded a bit, but especially Homecoming, which just it dipped and then just slowly glided to its exit and made a lot of money and had a pretty decent multiplier. If Ant-Man doesn't follow that, then there's some concern there. Do you do a third Ant-Man movie? Is it the character? Is there a slight oversaturation of comic book movies right now? You could make that argument, right? Avengers Infinity War came out 2 months ago. What else came out? Deadpool 2 came out was it a week after or 2 weeks after that? And so there's just been a lot coming out. I don't necessarily buy that all that much. I think Ant-Man's just a smaller part of the MCU world, pun intended as always. And I don't ever see it necessarily being $150 million opener, or even something like Captain America Civil War or the Thor or Iron Man. It never seemed like Ant-Man was ever going to reach those heights. And I don't even know if MCU or Disney wants that, because Ant-Man's a nice little reprieve from all of that bombast and super seriousness of MCU. It's comedic. It's a little bit more low key. The stakes are not as high. I think it's a little bit more of a relaxing viewing, if anything, especially the first one. So I don't know. I think if I had to sort of wrap up its performance right now, it's a little bit underwhelming. I thought that it was going to do much better than this, but it's not a disaster. It's not a flop. It's still going to make plenty of money and profit. It's just sort of a little bit of an underperformance, I think, due from the expectation of not only people in the industry, but also box office nerds like me. So that was number 2 this weekend. Number 3 was Skyscraper. On this, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on this one. So Skyscraper is an action movie starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. It opened up at 25.5 this weekend. Not very high at all. Per theater average was just shy or just over $6,700 per theater. So this one's a little bit of a flop right now, and everything that I've read so far about it, they're already doing postmortems on Deadline. It's already just, hey, this is going to be a flop. It's certainly not where I expected it to open. Tracking had it higher than this, I think in the 30s. My expectation for this was probably similar to a San Andreas. which opened up at 54. I was thinking like maybe 10 below that, like mid 40s. The fact that it hardly cracked into the 20s, there was even some with the preview numbers were really depressed. There was the thought that it could drop below 20, but it recovered a little bit Friday, Saturday. So $25 million for this. You know, what's the story on this movie, right? $125 million production budget. So it's a pretty hefty price here. In terms of the response to the film from critics, they hated it. 51% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's from 155 reviews. The average rating was 5.3 out of 10, which is very bad. So critics did not like it at all. 52 on Rotten Tomatoes, which I find to be a lot more accurate in terms of, I love on Metacritic, 52 on Metacritic. I love Rotten Tomatoes. I think it's a really cool, interesting site, but the thought process and philosophy behind their scores, I think, is a little bit stupid. And I don't mean like it's insulting stupid. It's just sort of like, it's not really well thought out. And I know that it's not there for simplicity's sake. Oh, is it fresh or is it not? From a marketing and branding perspective, that's why Rotten Tomatoes has won over the last decade or however long they've been around. They're like the number one rating service now for movies, was because they made it simple and marketable, right? The problem there is like the scores aren't specific enough. And the line between, I think the biggest problem is that you'll have like an art film score like a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, and you'll have like an MCU movie score like a 95%. So the way people think is, and this is how anybody would think this way, I think this way, I see that those two scores like, oh my God, these MCU films are masterpieces. They're not. And I think that it creates a really false perception of a higher quality for sort of like blockbuster popcorn films versus like the artistic quality of the film. This is why I always sort of revert back to Metacritic, because they give like an actual score and then average those scores. So in the case of Skyscraper, it's not that big of a difference, but I feel like if you look at other movies, its Metacritic score is like a lot lower than its Rotten Tomatoes score. And so I don't know, like we'll look at Sorry to Bother You in a bit and see how that, from an art film perspective, how Rotten Tomatoes differs from Metacritic. But the bottom line with Skyscraper is critics did not like it at all. Audience scores 79% Rotten Tomatoes, just throwing it out there. I don't believe it's true. On Cinema Score, I got a B+. So right off the bat, we're noticing there's a little bit of a quality problem. That Cinema Score should easily be A-A if it was a good film. It doesn't look like that is. And so, you know, a lot of people have been bringing up, so, okay, the postmortem already, right? It's probably not going to make money compared to like San Andreas or Rampage. It's not going to get there. Deadline says if Skyscraper ends up grossing $75 million stateside, which I don't even know if it's going to get there. It doesn't look like it's going to. If Skyscraper ends up grossing $75 million stateside and does 70% of its box office internationally, which makes sense because it's an international focused film, finance sources tell us the pick doesn't reach break even. Let's do some quick math. Like I'm doing this on the fly, so we'll see how this works. So let's assume that, okay, so I can do total costs. $125 million production budget, 3x that is about $375 total cost, right? That's very back of the napkin math, but we're going to use that. Let's say it does 75, and let's divide that by 35%. Let's say it does probably does like 230 internationally. Yeah, this isn't going to come close to being profitable. Because remember, global take on box office does not 100% go to the studio, right? It goes, in the United States, 50% of ticket sales goes to the studio. The other half goes to the movie theaters. Internationally, it's like about 40%. In China itself, it's 25% only goes to the studio. Now, this would be a different story if Skyscraper was a Chinese production, but it is considered a United States production, so the studio is only going to get 25% of the ticket sales in China, which is bad news for this movie. Let's just say it overperforms and does 250 to be nice to it. It's only going to make at most, it's going to make 90% of that back as actual revenue. And that's all platforms, all regions, right? So at most, it's not looking good. At most, it's going to do about 225 in terms of actual revenue into the studio. Now, again, these are ballpark estimates. I already put costs at well over 300 million, 350, 375. Yeah, you're looking at a pretty significant loss here. This will not be profitable. There's no way you could swing it to be profitable. If it was in like a $50 million range, like cost versus revenue, you could sort of say that Universal would find a way to do it. There's no way Skyscraper is going to make money. And so we do have to dive into the postmortem then. We know that it's a flop already in its first weekend. Unless it has some miraculous overperformance over the next few weeks. This is bad news, right? This is pretty bad news. And so, you know, if I sort of dive into it from my perspective alone, I look at a movie like Skyscraper and I have a lot of questions, right? One, terrible name. Two, it does kind of seem, the marketing seemed very tepid and very muted. It seemed like a banal version of Die Hard, right? So those are the things that I'm seeing. I'm seeing kind of a pretty poor concept. It looks like a stupid action movie, but it doesn't really have the fun of a typical stupid action movie. There's no real edge to the marketing, no real edge to the concept. It's opening right in the middle of summer movie season, so it's very competitive. If I'm going to point to a significant problem here, it was just a bad concept, right? The product development here didn't really make a lot of sense. I know that Dwayne Johnson was involved in like the producing side of it too. So he was all on board with this movie. He's done a ton of marketing for it. He's been out there really selling this movie. So I don't see any problem necessarily on the marketing strategy here. I think it was just really hard to sell this film because it looks so boring. You know, what makes Skyscraper stand out to anybody? It's like, oh, it's Dwayne Johnson. He's sort of an action movie star now. He's an A-lister. He's in this movie about a really high skyscraper and shit goes wrong. But when you watch the marketing, and there's one thing that I noticed with the marketing a little bit, was that, keep in mind this movie debuted in Beijing, right? So there's a very strong sort of Asia focus, I think, to the marketing and to the film itself. The way that it was shot, and from what I saw from the trailers and movie clips, it has this almost like weird CGI's glaze to everything. The color palette just looks really not engaging and to use the term again, muted. It just felt really banal, almost bromidic. There was nothing pulling me in with the visuals or the concept at all. So I think this movie was kind of fated to fail from the start. A lot of people have talked about, especially Deadline, and have seen in the box office forums, oh, Dwayne Johnson is overexposed, right? This is his third big movie here this year so far, if you count Jumanji, which did make most of its money this year. Rampage, right? His third big movie this year. They're saying, oh, he's out there too much. You know, it's like people are getting sick of him. They want to see a fresh face or something like that. I definitely accept that as a potential issue here, but as Deadline notes in their notes for this weekend, where is this? I gotta find the statistic here. 72% of Skyscraper's audience bought tickets because of The Rock, which was up from 38% on San Andreas. So the only reason this movie made money at all is because people showed up for The Rock. So I don't find the overexposure argument to be super strong. It's a valid argument, but I don't see a lot of meat on the bones there. Dwayne Johnson is an old school A-lister movie star. He exudes celebrity. He exudes just being at the center of everybody's attention. He's one of the most, he's the paradigm of a movie star. And maybe a little bit of a throwback to like the 90s or 80s movie stars. He's not like super concerned with reality TV and all that other bullshit like we've saw in the 2000s and currently. So he has a different style to him, a little bit more classy style to him. So I don't see anything wrong with his image or the overexposure. I think people want to see him as often as they want, which I think is, 3 big movies a year. That makes sense to me for someone like Dwayne Johnson. So I don't think that the overexposure thing is a major factor here. I just think it was a stupid idea, and it was a really boring concept. If they renamed it something else, like you call it Skyscraper, come on, just remake Towering Inferno. and then there's something there. There's some hook there, right? But this one just seems super boring. In terms of who saw the movie, Deadline had some good demographic information. 51% was female, 49% male, 73% was over 25, so definitely skewed older. In terms of who enjoyed this movie the most, this is all coming from CinemaScore, by the way. The under 18 group really liked it a lot, giving it A- versus the overall B+ that I did get. Also, the 25 to 34 year old crowd also gave it an A-. So, you know, it's just one of those movies. The lesson here and the sort of the big takeaway is, okay, you're going to release an action movie in the summer with a big A-list star, right? Doesn't matter unless you do the marketing and the conception of the movie right. Change the name. From what I hear from people who saw it, apparently it's really boring. So, you know, if you want to compete in this super competitive market, and it's not just a market with other films, it's a market with people's attention now, right? Like there's 100 movies released every day on Netflix. It seems like there's so many home entertainment options and things to do besides going to see a movie. You got to hook people in, and once you hook them in, you got to pull them right into the movie with like amazing marketing, a fantastic, innovative, original concept. The Quiet Place is a perfect example. Here's a small film made for $19 million that had really just fantastic marketing, a really cool, engaging concept, and people showed up, and they showed up in droves. They didn't show up in droves for Skyscraper because it didn't have those things. And I think that's sort of the mini post-mortem for Skyscraper, even on its opening weekend, but it's already looking like a loss of $50 to $100 million from my math. So not a good opening for Dwayne Johnson. Just in terms of how he's doing overall, Rampage, I think, is a flop in my book. On Deadline, they were saying it's going to make money at the end of like 2-year cycle of like digital and streaming rights, whatever. It's a flop. I factor that stuff in, but it did not do well. Jumanji was a huge win. Baywatch was a flop. Fate of the Furious did really well. Central Intelligence did pretty well as well. Since San Andreas, going back 3 years now, I think was a big win for him. So he's got ups and downs. You know, obviously San Andreas, Central Intelligence, Fate of the Furious, and Jumanji were hits. Baywatch, Rampage, and Skyscraper are flops. He said two flops in a row in the action space. He's a little bit better, I think, as a draw for into comedies. I think there's something where he plays a little bit against his physical image. He's great in comedies. He's always been good in comedies ever since, what was that one? God, it came out so long ago. Oh, Be Cool. He was so good in that. That was one of the first movies he really got his start in, and he showed off his comedic chops. I just feel like that's his strong point as a movie star. He's the big muscular guy that's also like self-deprecating and funny. Like that's his strength. Okay, anyway, that's enough about Skyscraper. That's enough of a deep dive on that movie. All right, let's keep this train rolling. Let's go a little bit quicker with these, the rest of the top 10. Incredibles 2 did $16.2 million, a great 43% drop. It's starting to lose theaters, so it's a little bit on that downward glide. 3,700 theaters. Per theater average was about $4,400 per theater. Total take so far on Incredibles 2, I can't even believe this number. It's made $536 million by its 5th weekend. Well into the $500 million range. It's like hard to even wrap my head around what is going on with this movie. It's just, what a wonderful performance. Massive grand slam for Disney here. Obviously Incredibles 3 or some offshoot movie is going to be fast tracked to be released in a couple of years, which is probably a mistake because one of the reasons it did so well was that like there was a lot of built up nostalgia for it from the original. But a fantastic performance for Incredibles 2 so far. Kind of a historic run, the best performing animation film of all time. Okay, so number 5 was Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. An okay 46% drop. It came in at $15.5 million. This one's starting to lose theaters too. Lost about 650 theaters. Its per theater average in its 4th weekend was $4,200. Total take so far for Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, $363 million. Obviously, this is not going to get anywhere close to the original. On my math that I did a couple of weeks ago, it's looking probably like at least $100 million profit. So it's not a flop in the traditional sense for Universal, but I think a significant underperformance that will put the third film, if not in jeopardy, I think they're going to creatively sort of revamp that series and give us something new. I know the audience reactions were not good. The critical reactions from movie critics was pretty bad for this movie. So I do think it needs a little bit of a soft reboot to keep the series going in the right direction. Number 6 was The First Purge. I guess this is only its second weekend. It opened up on July 4th, so it's a little bit weird opening here. 9.1 million for the weekend, a 47, almost 48% drop, which is pretty good for a kind of a horror thriller movie like this. It actually added theaters this weekend, 7 theaters. I don't know why. Per theater average was just over $3,000 per theater. Total take so far for The First Purge, $50 million so far. Only a $13 million production budget on that. This is, it's part of the whole series. The Purge series is getting old and worn. This one's doing pretty well. From a profit perspective, a financial perspective, they're going to keep churning these out because they're always profitable. This one will be profitable without a doubt. It's Universal Blumhouse doing their thing again. Their great collaboration and pumping out these low budget horror and thrillers. They really can't go wrong at this point. They could lose like 5 movies in a row that flop, and they'll come back with like another huge one that's going to do well. Like they are really on a great run. And The First Purge, despite the fact that it's a little bit sort of depressed compared to some of the other movies in the series, I kind of feel like the whole concept has run its course, especially because this one's kind of not like a prequel, but like an origin story of the whole series. I feel like they gotta put it to bed for at least 3 or 4 years before they bring it back up, but we'll see what they do. Number 7 was Sorry to Bother You. This is sort of the art movie hype. I believe it won Sundance in January. This is coming out from Annapurna. Did 4.2 million this weekend. I thought it was actually going to go a little bit higher based on estimates. But anyways, 4.2 million. This is part of its wide expanse. It was only on 16 theaters last week. It added about 789. Total theater count right now for Sorry to Bother You is 805. Its per theater average is $5,300, just about that. Total take so far for Sorry to Bother You is 5.3 million. This really, really overperformed on its 16 theater opening weekend. Massive numbers. There was a big question mark here about what it was going to do in its wide release. What I'm seeing here, based on these numbers, and it's hard to pinpoint because you don't see a lot of releases like this, where it goes from 16 theaters to 800 theaters. Like, it doesn't happen a lot. So the per theater averages is usually what we focus on in terms of performance. I can't really tell here if it's going to break out like super strong. When I saw that number, its per theater average on the 16 theater range, I think it was like $45,000 per theater. Now, if it was a super limited opening, like 4 theaters, and it was $45K, I'd be like, whatever. That's pretty good for New York, Los Angeles. But that just says nothing about how a movie's going to do outside those cities. And this one, it made the leap from the big, massive cities to a more wider release here. The $5,300 per theater average seems a little bit lower to me than I thought it was going to go. I was thinking more like $7,000 per theater. But again, I'm not an expert on the limited release going wide stuff. There's not enough of a data set for me in my head to certainly make a judgment call on it. But what I'm seeing here is it's 5.3 million, which is good. The thing they have to worry about, and Annapurna has had some trouble here as a newer studio. They usually focus on artier films like this and trying to push them wide, and they have not done a great job so far. And my concern here is that from what I'm seeing, if they try and bump this up to 1,500 theaters or maybe even 2,000 theaters, like a true wide release, I feel like it's going to die on impact. It definitely has that feeling of like, hey, this is going to play well in big cities, but the moment you get out to like the suburbs of Omaha, it's going nowhere. And I think in order to really break out as an indie film and do something like Big Sick did, or even like something like Lady Bird, which was a little bit smaller, you're gonna have to play to that suburban San Antonio crowd, the suburbs of Chicago. Like, you're gonna have to play to that crowd. If you can't do it, then you're not gonna break out. And I get the feeling right now that I'm looking at these numbers, I don't think Sorry to Bother You is really gonna break out that much. It's a fantastic performance for the film. Don't get me wrong. This is a small indie film that is super artistic and pushes the boundaries in a lot of ways, especially narratively. I'm gonna go see it. I'm a film lover. This looks like one of the best movies of the year. But I think from a just performance, financial, box office perspective, I don't see it super breaking out. I could be wrong. We'll have to keep watching and see how they do the expansion. But that $5,300 per theater average would worry me a little bit if I was Anna Perner. Can we push this out to 1,500 theaters? The worst thing that they could do is push it out really wide, really quickly, and it dies. And not only do you lose financially, you lose clout within the industry. Because people look at it like, a good example would be Dope and Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl a few years ago. Sundance darlings, really, really good films. Critics loved them. They tried to push them wide in the summer season, just like this, and they died. And there goes not only your money, but all your awards contention as well. Because the awards, as much as they want to say they're all about artistic recognition, it's really about hype within that group of people in the industry. And if you don't make money, people don't give a shit. That just is what it is. So, Sorry to Bother You. I'm going to keep an eye on that one. I hope it does really well. It looks great. I haven't seen it yet. Artistically, it looks fantastic. I hope it can break out a little bit, but I don't see it happening. Sicario Dave Soldado was 3.8 million this weekend, a 49% drop. Ouch, lost 1,000 theaters. This one's making a quick exit. Per theater average was below 2,000, below our Mendoza line for a wide release. No wonder it's losing all these theaters. Total take so far for Sicario 2, as I'll call it, $43.2 million. This one, I don't know how I feel about this one. I can't really, obviously it's doing better than the original. The original was one of the best action movies made in the last 10, 20 years. Really, really great movie. Not a great ending, but I won't get into that. Really was a great film overall, not just action film. So when the sequel got announced and Emily Blunt wasn't involved and the original director was not involved, it seemed kind of like, well, why are you doing this? Like, I know Josh Brolin's in it, and Benicio del Toro's in it, but at the same time, it just feels like an afterthought. The trailers looked kind of fun, but it looked like a more actiony, less arty version of Sicario. Sicario is really artistically, has a lot of artistic integrity to it. And Sicario 2 just kind of looked like an action movie. Now, look, it's done okay, $43 million. But I can't help but think that this was either like a lost opportunity or like kind of just a bad idea from the start. Is it going to be profitable? I have no idea for a movie like this. No clue about the financials and how this is going to work, especially when it's smaller like this. I don't know. It just feels a little bit underwhelming, to be honest with you, based on the acclaim and love of the original. If there was, if they could redo Sicario 2 with Emily Blunt, I think it does double this, to be honest with you. Okay, anyway, so number 9 was Uncle Drew, 3.2 million, 51% drop, lost 1,000 theaters, just like Sicario. Per theater average is not doing well, just about $1,900 in its third weekend. This one's going to disappear pretty quickly. $36 million. I don't know what the production budget was on Uncle Drew. I don't think it could have been that high. I thought this one was going to break out. I had high hopes for it. It felt like the right movie at the right time. Really funny. I don't know. It felt like a breakout to me, and that did not happen. I was totally wrong about that. I think it's doing okay. And then let's close out the top 10. Ocean's 8, 2.9 million, 43% drop. That's pretty good. Lost about 1,000 theaters, just like Sicario and Uncle Drew. Per theater average in its sixth weekend is $1,800. Total gross is $132 domestically on a $70 million production budget. The problem is I can't remember how I read these films the week before, because I really kind of do it in the moment and seeing the numbers, and it was sort of like, what does this look like? I was a little bit down on the performance of this film, I remember. It just didn't seem like it popped off like I felt like it should have. And I think Warner Brothers, the marketing on this was way too late, wasn't innovative enough. They could have sold this film so much better than they did. And I think the issue here that I'm seeing, just looking at the numbers, domestically, it's okay, right? Like if you look at the other Ocean's 11 films, Ocean's 12 closed out at 125 back in 2004. Let's see if I can get some inflated numbers, because those are old movies. So the original closed out at 293 adjusted. Ocean's 12 closed out at 183. Ocean's 13 closed out at 155. So you know what? I'm looking at this now, and it's sort of like, wait, it's not really that far off Ocean's 13 at all. It should close somewhere around that, maybe a little bit below. So it's not like it underperformed that much. I think the issue here to me is like internationally, there's not a huge audience for this film. You know, normally the breakdown between domestic and international take these days, it used to be like 50-50. Now it's more like 40-60. And for really big movies, it's like 35-65. This one is 52% domestic, 47% foreign. You don't see that too often. And I'm looking at the foreign markets that it's opened in, and it's had a pretty wide opening worldwide so far. So I don't know if there's other markets that might sort of pick this up later, but it's only made 251 worldwide. Again, going back to my sort of numbers, at best, it's going to pull on what, 90% of that is actual revenue. So you're looking at like 230. And in total cost are probably going to be around 200. So look, it's fine. I think it's definitely going to be in the profitable side of things. I just felt like it was a really fresh take on that movie and that genre, and it didn't really perform up to the expectations of its concept. It was one of like really great concepts, maybe kind of poor execution and poor marketing execution, as opposed to like Skyscraper, which is a stupid concept and should have never been made. Okay, but that's Ocean's 8. So a little bit, I think it's going to be profitable for Warner Brothers, but I'm personally disappointed by its performance as a product, right? Okay, that is the top 10. Anything else we want to talk about outside of the top 10? Won't You Be My Neighbor did 1.8 million, dropped only 27% this weekend. Fantastic. One of the lower drops of a wide release. It's starting to lose theaters, though. I'm not really sure why. It's in its 6th weekend. Won't You Be My Neighbor is currently at 15.8 million. Really big win for Focus Features in this documentary. There's been so much great buzz about it. I expect that to perform quite well into its 7th, 8th, maybe even 10th or 12th weekend. And then at that point, on its 12th weekend, it'll hit home entertainment. It might already be close to be hitting home entertainment. It's usually that 90-day window, 12-week window where it hits digital and VOD. So I think it's going to play really well through that period. Okay, so Won't You Be My Neighbor is doing really well as a documentary. Three Identical Strangers is, I think, also a documentary. It's been such weird buzz for this movie. From Neon, which is a company I really love. They're a brand new distributor and producer of films. I believe it was one of the Alamo Draft House, that big theater down in Austin, which is now like a countrywide brand of theaters. The founder of that helped start Neon. So it's just like, it's a really cool company. They put out awesome movies. Beach Rats, Ingrid Goes West, Gemini. If you haven't seen Gemini, please see Gemini. It's not a masterpiece, but it is such a well made film, visually and musically. You gotta see it. Okay, enough gushing about Neon. They're so cool. Three Identical Strangers had a lot of buzz to it. It's a documentary about three, I guess, twins who got separated for some reason. That's spoiler alert. I'm not going to go into it. Did $7,000 per theater on 170 theaters. That's not super good. If it's capping out at $7,000 per theater on less than 200 theaters, that thing's not going anywhere. Now, I think it's potential awards. I think it's going to be like a kind of a cult hit already within like indie and nerdy people like myself and artistically inclined folks, but that's not gonna get out to the masses at all. It doesn't seem like, unfortunately. What else opened limited or is limited that we can talk about? We got three other ones we can talk about really quickly. One is 8th Grade. Okay, keep your eye on this movie. This is from A24, another indie sort of distributor darling. This one has had super, super buzz ever since Sundance. It opened on 4 theaters. My guess is probably a couple in New York and a couple in Los Angeles is usually the art house vibe here for an opening. Per theater average was $63,000 per theater. Now, obviously, we're talking about theater averages. It's a whole different ballgame with limited releases, right? 4 is the standard opening for an art film, 4 theaters. So we have a good set of data about what's good and what's bad. And just in general, anything above $30K per theater is pretty good for a 4 theater opening, the New York, Los Angeles opening. Anything above $50K is really good. And then you'll have movies like Steve Jobs does over $100K per theater. The issue here is this. This is a fantastic performance for 8th Grade. I do not want to diminish that at all. It's a massive home run for A24, and it's an art house movie right now. The big question is, can it cross that Grand Canyon between art house and mass release win? You can't tell from limited releases. It's nearly impossible. Because a movie like Disobedience does like $45K per theater. Deadline says, oh, this is great. IFC says it's fantastic. It's not fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure Disobedience, which is about Orthodox Jewish people, is going to play well in Los Angeles and New York because there's a lot of Jewish people in those cities, right? But when you try and push it out wide, where there's a smaller Jewish population, it doesn't have this sort of doesn't have the hook to it, right? And so there's tons of cases. Death of Stalin, another example, opened fantastic in New York and Los Angeles. I think it was like $45K or maybe a little bit higher than that. Similar, dies on wide release, right? Because it's such a specific type of film for a specific type of audience that tends to live in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, places like that, the big, massive cultural centers. A lot of those movies have zero audience outside that space. Or if they do have an audience outside those cities, it's really small pockets, right? Like, where did Death of Stalin play well outside of, in the middle of the country? Like Iowa City or like Madison, Wisconsin, probably, because there's like arty people who live there. But it didn't play well in like Milwaukee or like Cedar Rapids. You know what I mean? So that's the big Grand Canyon here that these films sometimes try to cross and fail. They don't always try and cross that, right? Sometimes the studio knows, hey, this is an art film. It's not probably going to go anywhere, but we want it to do well in these big cities because that gets us recognition. It may not be a financial win for us, but it increases the prestige of the studio, which allows us to get bigger names to do bigger films. So that's one of the reasons why they do that. And they just say, hey, like this is going to play well in New York, and that's it. That's all we really need. Now, is 8th Grade one of those films? Which kind of film is it? Is it just a pure art film that's going to play well in the big cosmopolitan cities, and that's it? Or is it going to have a little bit of a breakout, or is it really going to break out? Like a Big Sick or a Lady Bird is a really good example, right? Art film that broke out somewhat to the wide audiences. With 8th Grade, I think it does have a chance to cross that canyon because of the subject matter, because of the way that it's shot, and just the vibe of the film. I think it does have potential to really, really break out. Now, what does breakout look for a movie like this? Anything over 20 million would be a huge win. If it gets over 30 million or like over 40 million, which I think both Big Sick and Lady Bird did do, then it's a grand slam for a small studio like A24. Is 8th Grade going to do that? I don't know yet. That $63K per theater is a really good sign. But until it gets to Omaha, I don't know how it's going to play, is really what it comes down to. And we'll see how they expand it. I hope they keep it limited for at least a month. Maybe like expand it out to Chicago, Miami, Atlanta, maybe in a place here like in Nashville, and then just do a slow roll, build that hype, build that clout up that this movie is amazing and you have to see it, and then it has a chance to play well in Omaha. I love that I use Omaha. San Antonio, right? Just like a kind of mid-tier city, right? Not massive, huge, not that like international, but like a mid-tier American city. And then it has a fighting chance to play well in those cities. If they try and expand this wide, next week, like over 1,000 theaters, or 2 weeks from now, it's going to fail. I almost guarantee it's going to fail because it does not have the cultural clout yet, the cultural recognition that can spread through a limited release to these other cities. It just doesn't have the awareness yet. But you can't go wrong with a $63K per theater opening on its opening weekend on 4 theaters. So Eighth Grade is doing quite well right now. What is not doing well is Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot, from Amazon Studios. This is Gus Van Sant film with Joaquin Phoenix, Jonah Hill, Rooney Mara, Jack Black. Danny Elfman composed the music. This one had no chance. This is a pure art film that's only going to play well in big cities. I could list you like the 10 cities this is going to play well in, and that's it. It's not going to play well anywhere else. It's just for art house people, art house nerds. And opened this weekend 4 theaters, just like Eighth Grade. Whereas Eighth Grade did $63K per theater. Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far only did $20K per theater, which is pretty bad for an art house release here. It's not going anywhere. It's done. Which is expected. The moment I saw that, so one thing I have to do often, because I do this podcast and I'm super interested in the movie business, and I try to engage myself in it pretty constantly. The one thing I have to do when I approach a movie is I have to separate my personal feelings for it, the artistic feelings for it, versus the business feelings for it, because they're 2 different worlds. Now, obviously, sometimes they overlap. But when I saw a movie like Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot, it's a movie that I would watch, that I'm interested in seeing, and I think a lot of people are interested in seeing. The problem is that there is no way that this film will connect with more than 500,000 people in this country, or 1 million people, I should say. It's just not going to. And in order to win at the box office, you have to connect with millions upon millions of people. There's no way that movie was ever going to do that. It's an art house flick through and through, and it's never going to be anything more than that. And so I'm interested in it. I really want to see it, but at the same time, I realize from a business perspective, it's going to be kind of a little bit of a failure for Amazon. I don't know why Amazon picked up that movie. This is not a good idea. They did great with Big Sick, a great selection for a sort of crossover hit. They should have picked up Eighth Grade. I feel like that has an okay chance of crossing over. But Don't Worry, no, it has 0. Never had a chance of crossing over. 0. Okay. Let's get through the rest of this here. The only one thing I want to talk about is Shock and Awe. It is a movie about the lead up to the Iraq War. Rob Reiner directed, Woody Harrelson, James Marsden, Jessica Biel, Tommy Lee Jones. Great cast, great director. Something happened with Rob Reiner, and I cannot figure out what happened to him. Obviously he's a huge director and has been for a long time. Started out with This Is Spinal Tap in the 80s, which is a classic. Stand By Me, did Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, Misery. The hits just kept going and going and going. The Bucket List, even more recently. He has not, unfortunately, had a movie go over the 50 million mark since 2010. He did Flipped, which was a huge flop. The Magic of Belle Isle, which made no money. And So It Goes, which made no money. Being Charlie, which made no money. His latest one, I don't even know if it was released. It was released in theaters. I followed this movie for a long time. It was LBJ, with Woody Harrelson as LBJ. But it kept on getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, the release. And finally, they put it out in November 2017, this last fall. Only does 2.4 million total. And so his latest one, and the other reason I'm bringing up this movie is obviously it's a big name director. His career is just completely tanked ever since, for a good 10 years it's tanked, which is too bad because he's such a talented director. And this is such a great cast. The other reason I'm bringing this up, because it was released in 100 theaters from a company that released Gotti, Vertical Entertainment, which I believe is interconnected with the Movie Pass somehow. Open 100 theaters, per theater average, folks, $410. $410. That's especially bad in any event, right? That's terrible. It might be one of the worst openings of all time. It's especially bad because the theater count is so low. If it was 410 and it had opened on, 3,000 theaters or something like that, it would be like catastrophic. Let's see, it doesn't even break. Man, it doesn't even really break. It breaks the top 20 worst all time. They don't have it up yet, but James Marsden, by the way, folks, has 2 movies in the top 10 worst openings of all time in terms of per theater average, which is the most important metric. The D Train and now Shock and Awe. James Marsden, he's got Westworld, so who cares, right? Too bad for Rob Reiner. The movie looks pretty good. I'm going to see it. It's already up on VOD somewhere, so I'm going to go get it. I'm really interested in that time period. I was alive protesting a lot during that time period. And so it's too bad to see a movie like that. It just had I think the big story here that's going around in my head while I mentioned this is like, this movie has no place in movie theaters. None. Like, unless the movie theater industry switches over to a more patron, club member subscription based business, where art house people would just go see this basically kind of almost for free, or the real price they'd pay, like $3 or something like that, based on like a subscription model. There's no place for this movie in the multiplex. It should be on Netflix. It should be on HBO. It'd be a great HBO film on a Saturday night. There's no reason why they released this. It was a really stupid waste of time. It's already up on VOD, so I don't know why they pushed it out. Maybe for awards contention. Not going to happen. Okay, that's all for this weekend, guys. I really appreciate you guys listening. Before I sort of I close out here, let's just walk through briefly what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Equalizer 2 comes out next weekend. Mamma Mia 2 comes out. Both should do decently well. Mamma Mia is looking like mid-30s. Unfriended Dark Web from Blumhouse Tilt. Blumhouse Tilt, again, is the imprint within Blumhouse that does the micro budgets, like, $2 million, $4 million for a movie. I'm sure that'll be profitable, but I don't think it's going to break out at all. Any limited releases? Not really. The McQueen documentary is coming out. That looks pretty good. Then the big one for July is going to be Mission Impossible Fallout. Got to keep an eye on that one. Normally you're thinking like a $50 to $70 million opening. The thing is, with Mission Impossible Fallout, the reviews are ecstatic. Some are calling it one of the best action movies of the last 10 years. Someone says like Mad Max Fury Road. So keep an eye on that one. I think it could have a chance of breaking out. Breaking out would be anything above 70, I would say. Maybe 80, maybe 90. If it really breaks out, maybe over $100 million opening weekend. So we're going to keep an eye on that. That one's going to be really interesting to watch. Teen Titans Go to the Movies from Warner Brothers also comes out on the 27th. Hot Summer Nights comes out from A24. I'm just like an A24 fanboy, a Neon fanboy. That's obviously, if you haven't listened to this podcast, I love everything they put out. I think it's so fascinating. Hot Summer Nights is not going to do anything. I think it was shelved for like a year or so. Then we're into August, and August is like super odd this year, just like it was last year. I see nothing really breaking out all that much. Besides Christopher Robin looks pretty good. I saw a trailer to that, and I think that's going to do quite well. Darkest Minds, Searching, The Spy Who Dumped Me. I don't see a lot going on with those. The one wild card is probably going to be Meg on August 10th. That could open at $15 million. That could open at $40 million. I have no idea how that's going to play. But I think it's going to be, it's fascinating to watch. Alpha's going to bomb. I don't know why they're releasing it then. Mile 22 is probably not going to do very well. On the end of summer of August, looks pretty boring to me. Slender Man, Happy Time Murderers, AXL, I have no idea what that is, from Global Road. Rich Crazy Asians comes out on the 15th of August. Look for that one, because that one could have a little bit of a breakout, I feel like. We'll see. Very targeted demographic, but that demographic shows up for movies, so could do it right. Okay, guys, that's this weekend's episode. I'm going to try and post my mid-year review. I just have been so lazy with posting. It feels like the mid-year's already passed, so it might be late. What I'm probably going to do is just post up each month, my review for each month of 2018, up on YouTube and Twitter and all that kind of stuff. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast.